Just a short intro. I'm Josh Baer. I'm an art advisor. I'm a publisher of a newsletter called the Baer Faxt, and I've done a number of these talks largely about the art market since I'm somewhat knowledgeable about that. But it's actually the first time that we heard a voice that we don't usually hear about when it terms market, which is an artist. We've had collectors, we've had dealers, consultants, speculators, all sorts of things. And I think in many ways, the voice of the artist needs to be heard more in museums, on boards, and about how this big brouhaha in the market is. So just a few words about Joseph. Most of you know that Joseph invented conceptual art in 1911.
Getting better.
Getting better right there, and make sure that he was first and all that. I've known Joseph since I was a kid, and he was a younger kid as an artist in New York.
I was a sort of cultural babysitter, you could say.
That's right. He actually, I think he remembers this. He gave me my first job, which was as a board member of White Columns. He hired me, and one of my first things I did was in coordination with Joseph. I got Joseph off the board. It was probably my first act, and he was a big supporter of that, so thank you for that.
Good reward.
And he's a world-class artist and curator, and we're lucky to have him.
I've never been a curator. I do curated installations.
Okay.
That's a whole other activity.
Well, we'll talk about that if we want. Joseph has a statement he would like to read, and then I'll ask him some questions. We'll have back and forth, and at the end we'll have some time for some questions from the audience. So welcome, Joseph.
Hello. As I won't be making it to the beach, I'm really happy about all the lighting. Okay. This is an interview it would be coming out in Purple magazine. And I thought it would set kind of the conditions of what I think needs to be said. And so I'm going to read a couple sections from it very quickly. Alexis Dahan was my interviewer in that. Okay. Let's start at the beginning, it's always better. I'm asked, what transformation do you think the world recently had? And I say, one of the biggest changes that is happening is the pernicious aspect of corporate culture, in which everything is under pressure to be reduced to a digital component, which means that prices, being numbers, easily replace real value, and the works are thus under siege for the meaning to be the meaning found in the market. This is a meaning having little to do with all the reasons we thought for centuries we were making meaning in culture in those ways of valuable to humans. It's all digitally distributed and reduced essentially to power relations, economic and otherwise. It's a continuing big problem. Generations of young artists and artisans are being formed in this culture. Are you talking about the evolution of art history? And I say, we've always had art history, and it was a history of who did what, when, and what was influenced, part of the history of ideas. And then 10, 15 years ago, maybe more, but I think about 15 is in its current exaggerated form, there became a new competitive art history to the classic one. This is the history of the art market. In this history, value is not established by ideas, but how expensive work is. It is as dumb as a kind of cultural lottery ticket. We know the names of those artists selling now for millions, but really have no clue as to why. We know that it has nothing to do with art history as we have known it. These works are often derivative and don't in fact qualify as important according to the classic terms of art historical activity. And so you have a lot of new people with lots of money coming into the art world who don't bother to really be educated about art. They only see what's expensive, and they can be seen as part of that limited circle who can afford to buy such work by having the right thing to have on their walls at the right time. So what this has done is really trashed to some degree the moral authority that art historically has had. Cultural authority has been replaced by financial authority. It's worth millions, quote unquote. What else do you need to know? It's a kind of dangerous and unhealthy situation. And he asks, how does that affect the value of your own work? And I say, well, the two art histories are in competition, and yet they're obviously happening simultaneously. This all began years ago. I was always fascinated about the prices of Duchamp, who was so clearly important, both to the modernist part of the century as well as what followed. Yet the prices of Picasso and the prices of Duchamp have never even been close. Once it became clear that Duchamp was more and more important, and his effect on the practice of art in the last half of the 20th century is understood, we've assessed the work differently. And so by now, we see he was a more important artist than Picasso. But the market never reflected that for a moment. Do you own the work by these artists? He asked me. Duchamp, I was able to trade a work of mine from the 60s for In Advance of the Broken Arm, the Snow Shovel by Duchamp. And I received 2 other smaller works along with it. Basically, I was young and trendy, relatively anyway, more young and trendy than Duchamp, certainly. At the time, my work was selling for more than Duchamp, which I thought was terrible and unjust, frankly. Of course, in the end, I'm happy to have the work, of course. And finally, Duchamp's prices are a little more correct now, shall we say. What about Picasso? A dealer of mine from Switzerland, Bruno Bischofberger, you all know him, said when I was quite young, Joseph, you don't really understand, you know. If you or I wanted an early Picasso, wanted a Picasso, you'd want an early analytic cubist painting, right? Because that's the work we think are the most important Picassos. Well, that isn't what the art market thinks. Because the people with really lots of money, they want a Picasso, but they don't know art. So they want to look like art. So they want the blue period. They want to own figurative Picassos. They don't want achromatic still lifes. They want the ones that they and their friends can recognize as art. So although they're not historically more valuable, they end up having a market value that's far greater due to market desire. So that's the idea of value. So the idea of value, in fact, ends up educating and shaping perceptions over the years. It's a little bit of a problem. So he asked, so do you think the art market wants art that looks like conceptual art? And I say, it's interesting, certainly, that they, meaning younger artists, have it easier than I did, but derivative work is still derivative work. It means something quite different than mine did at the beginning. It's all quite far from the origins of an art movement. But this makes my point really about how dumb, literally, the art market is. All that is necessary is to get in the hot zone of market desire, and then once there, anything, whether art is historically important or not, can go for millions. Is this what we want to think about? No. But the point is that we are forced to understand how the inflated price shapes experience, perception, and meaning. So I have to follow it, and I have to care about it to some degree. How do you see the evolution of art as language today? And I say, well, past the surface, someone has to stop and ask what makes work important. By and large, the art critical establishment is either silent or making a living from the recent market meld up. I think meld up is the right word, not meld down. Part of the problem is that there has been a kind of morphing of the concept of style into the market reality of branding. And so as a result, there's a lot of confusion about work. And a hot new brand, i.e. the work of a trendy young artist, for circles that have more money than education and intellectual engagement, that's enough. I hope I offended a whole lot of people here today.
That will. Now we can all go. So.
All right. So that was the setting perimeters. Since this is the space is named after Muhammad Ali, I figured.
Okay. So let's go to war here a little bit.
Right,
but by the way, how many people in this room are artists? It's always good to know.
Good.
Okay.
Good,
How
good.
many are gallerists or a couple of them? How many of you represent the artist? Okay. There we go. How many of the?
It's like the Nuremberg trial.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many are you collectors? How many of you?
I show with Sean Kelly in New York and Spruce Moggers in New York. I'm sorry.
And how many? Okay, and the rest are other, I guess, and things like that. So it's good to have a feel for who's in the room. To
custodial staff. No.
got lost along the way, and here for the comedy show. But Joseph, I don't think. Well, I agree. By the way, with your Picasso analysis is completely correct, or Bruno's analysis, but. Expensive art doesn't make bad art, and inexpensive art doesn't make good art.
Good accidents happen.
All parts of the matrix exist. So if only bad art did well in the market.
Yeah, then it'd be clear, but it's not clear.
But it's not clear.
That's
and
what consciousness
if
raising
all unsuccessful art was good, which it's not, that'd be clear too.
Fortunately, I came with a tan. Yeah.
So it's, and since each one of us know which are the exceptions to the rule, because we're all smarter, right? So we know when it's expensive and good, and when it's cheap and bad. But you're not.
That's the fun of the art fair, right?
Well, You've never been here
That's
before,
actually-
right?
What?
Have you been to?
Not Miami, no.
But you've been to Basel and stuff like that.
In the Basel. I go, but I'm very polite. I go when I'm invited.
You go.
Like I'm here today, like this, but I don't hang out.
Do you pay attention to who's showing your work at art fairs?
I can tell you, at the first Basel I was ever at, I was sitting there. This is very, thank you, very offensive, of course. But I was sitting with John Baldessari. We neither of us had ever been at an art fair before, and we're sitting there dumbstruck by what we're watching. And some journalist said, "Wow, real artist!" And he came over. "So, what do you think of the Basel Art Fair?" And I said, "Well, I feel like a whore at a pimp's convention." But John beat me. He said, "It's like watching your parents fuck."
So
This
are
is
you?
an X-rated conversation?
Yeah,
First
so it'll
one.
be on YouTube later. So do you pay attention though to like who's bringing your works to the art fairs, which gallery, what they're doing, or you just like I don't need to know, or are you aware of who's got stuff?
Can you
Or
do
people-
both at the same time?
I suppose you can, as an artist, sure.
Yeah, no.
So you're
Well,
doing both.
Yeah, I mean, you. It's very hard to pretend to be stupid when you're not. This I've learned is a lifetime lesson. But so you have ways of this is not working. But technology is half of all these experiences.
Do you want a microphone? Can we give Joseph a handheld? That might be easier for him.
And
It's working, but it's the ear part.
I could hold it like.
Just take this. It's phallic. I'm sorry, but
I'm not competitive in every area.
we can't say that it's always masturbatory. The artist, but here.
gotten us on that track.
Okay, so you're paying attention.
You have to hold the microphone like
Right that.
I got.
Now I understand why Frank Sinatra looked like he was eating it all those years. Yeah.
So you are paying attention. You're in the. Unfortunately, there's Joseph Kosuth Inc. or Joseph Kosuth LLC or whatever. Paying attention to business around you. You pay attention to it, don't you? Yes or no?
At the beginning of the month.
Beginning of the month.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, are you? Let's get away from the art fairs. What about prices? You're paying attention to that, right?
What?
The price of your work. You got to pay attention to that, right?
Yeah, but see, I do a lot of different kinds of work. So there's a lot of different kinds of prices. So it's not like I was a painter doing, apartment-sized paintings and they could all be compared. I do big installations for cities. I do, and I do smaller works. I do whatever, I feel like doing.
So you're spending even more time figuring out that
No,
because
I
you got
spend
all
even
these.
less time because it's, I just wait for my dealers to give me good news, basically.
Just send the checks but do you pay attention to your work that comes up at auction?
People let me know whether or not I kind of, I'm certain. I'm
You're aware-
choking up at this question.
Have some water. You don't want to answer, just say it. Let's move on.
There was a moment which I did earlier in my career. But, my generation, I never knew what other artists were selling for. I considered it none of my business. And, it's really true. I know it's hard to believe in this world. And in the 80s, it began to change with the trans-avant-garde artists. And they were like, it was like a horse race. And they could see who was winning by who was selling for higher amount, which was, I thought, really the beginning of a bad thing. And
But I think in the 80s, the artists were saying quality equals price. I'm as good as that one, so my prices should be that. I can speak of Leon Goldman and Nancy Sparrow in this way because they're both no longer here to defend themselves, but they're famous political artists and left-wing, and I can tell you, more concerned about their retail prices than any other artist I dealt with. Because for them, it meant reputation. Now, they were more than happy to give big discounts to get things done to be loved, but they really cared. And I think in the 80s, artists really started, and you're a 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, 10s
I've been
artist.
around forever, yeah.
You had to have cared at some certain point.
Yeah, I'm not saying I didn't care. I think I'd be disingenuous. But whether it was on the front burner or nervously poised on the back burner is a difference. Should I put it that way?
Now,
That wasn't what. First off, it was transit. My work's steadily going up, not nearly as fast as maybe 85% of the art world that we were talking about. But it's fine, from my point of view. I mean, I was always the most expensive conceptual artist. And I never knew what that meant exactly.
Just as long as you were ahead of Lawrence Weiner, that's all that mattered,
what's
right?
What's his name again?
So it's that guy with the beard.
It is Christmas time, but I think it's rude of you to bring it up like that.
Do you pay attention? Do you care if somebody who's bought your work sells it? Is it like, does it bother you? Once it's gone from your, I was raised by artists, so when I left the house, it's gone.
Collectors, have been important because work like Mike Panza bought 23 works of mine before I was 25 years old. So I had enormous support from a very important collector in Europe. And that, of course, made a big difference for my life and also in terms of the people who followed him, right? So, but at the same time, he was a super engaged collector. And so it really mattered. If he would have dumped everything, the way Saatchi did with Keo, it would have been heartbreaking not because of money, but because of what it meant in terms of losing belief in me, right? And we had a period, a moment in which several dealers that had been very engaged with conceptual art began to show, Transvagardia and returning to painting, and this was like, and I was like, at least 2 hours, I basically was the person keeping the doors open. And so one actually chided me, I won't say who. He said, "Joseph, I've sold more I've sold more of these paintings this week than I've sold your work all year. You had us on a diet." That was his attitude about conceptual. That way, And the point was, I never knew it was about money. I mean, I thought, yes, you need support, and yes, but that shouldn't be. Elegant people don't put that in the front of the conversation.
Well,
and those with a real agenda that's more culturally engaged and intellectually inspired don't put it at the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that 80% of the dialogue is about, and as an art advisor, sometimes more is about the money than about the art. That's certainly been the case, but the dollars have become so much higher that it's hard to ignore that. And it's less about patron. Yeah. Panza was a patron, in a sense, more than a collector, wouldn't you say? It let you not have to wait tables.
Yeah, that's true, but he patronized by buying work, and he put together quite an amazing collection.
But does the deal end? I think artists often feel like there's this emotional break when someone sells something, but the transaction is, I give you this, my artwork, you give me this, a check with my name on it. That should be a clear transaction. The buyers feel that, do the artists feel that? And I have a follow-up question, which is, there's a big desire to come back again for artist resale royalty fees. How do you feel about that?
I think that...
does anybody not understand that issue, by the way?
Artists need support, and so that certainly is a valid way of giving it to them. I mean, I remember Rauschenberg, he was telling everybody, and he told me during that famous skull auction, and he said, "Joseph, never let go of your early work. Don't make the mistake I made." This kind of thing. It's good to have ongoing engagement with your own history and not watch other people reaping the financial rewards of it. That's true. But again, there's just too much emphasis on this shit. That's the problem.
Well, but as an intellectual...
As we sit here at Miami, Basel,
Basel.
Yeah.
And I think you did demand private jet to come here.
Yeah, no, that's separate.
That's separate. Don't go into that. It's
not true. He's trying to malign me.
Business class, I hope, but he did.
By the way, I just wanted to point out, in the case of Panza, it wasn't until I had a kind of retrospective. I think it's called a survey at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris when I was 28, and at that press conference for that, I let everyone know that I was 28, but nobody had known my age. So when Panza, I had 30 shows before I was 25. So when Panza bought all this work, it was like based on the work. I mean, it was really...
But don't you think those people... I think it's unfair to think there's only speculators and only new people and only idiots buying art.
No, that's not true. I didn't even imply
the reality is everything is now going on simultaneously, and that serious collectors exist. They may not come to art fairs. They may like to go to galleries.
There's a lot
they
of
may
very
not
serious
go
collectors.
to. They don't
Who
go to
else,
auctions.
Why else would I sell even one work? There wasn't a lot of serious collectors.
Do they ask you your opinion of who to sell the work to? The gallery. So you just leave it to them. Do a good job. Do the right thing.
Well, there are some people, certainly institutions I want to be in, but also private collectors that make a difference.
But
Who
at
have
the
a
end of the
level
month,
a
when
level
that
of
first is
seriousness.
coming,
What's that?
and when it's the end of the month and the first is coming, a little less worried about the right guy buying it. Then,
If you need the money, then it's too late by then anyway. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think when everybody's
Process takes too long for
these
that.
artists with the 300-person waiting list now, that in 10 years they'll be addressed as waiter, will be more than happy to sell to whoever walks in the door when times are rough.
Well, look at the works that Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried were promoting in the 60s, and as the true art compared to this awful novelty art of pop and minimal. And you know, I'm sorry, but the work is lost.
But don't you
to
think
art
maybe
history,
critics, I said this in press, Roberta Smith recently wrote in the New York Times this article about how wrong this Bacon, you know, talking about a Bacon selling for 140 million. My view is stick to writing about the art, but the people, the economists, stick to writing about the market. Don't cross, you know, it's like, you know,
Well, that's sort of
art
what
critics
that's
who
what I was
wear
saying.
product codes and like to stay at the Four Seasons maybe shouldn't critique the art market and stick to their guns and where they talk about.
Some truths are truistically true.
Now, since I'm such an expert, Joseph, what would you like to know about the art market that you don't know? That your dealers aren't necessarily telling you, having at a gallery? Is there anything that's like, after nearly 50 years of being in this, 40 years, whatever, you got it all?
I worry more, you know, this is one of the things I never thought I'd really care about since I thought I was 25 almost my whole life.
Well, we're both immature.
Which got me in trouble. It still gets me in trouble in terms of my dating schedule. But still, I think that we realize its effect on how artists see their own activity. And people engaged in curatorial, the intellectual workers, shall we say. What are you pointing at?
The microphone.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Frank Sinatra. The reason, you know, that, and I think it's a pernicious effect on that self-identity of an artist. As I've told my students for years, you know being an artist is not a job because artists don't retire. And it's a calling, truth of the matter. And there's a moral authority to being an artist, whether you're a big seller or you don't sell at all, but because you're devoting your life to doing that activity, that has to be preserved. It's very important. Our world is engaged by people committed to short-term goals. Politicians want to do whatever they need to keep the power. Businessmen, at the end of the day, have to make a profit. And so those are, by nature, short-term goals. There are the people in society, artists, philosophers, novelists, whoever, who are engaged in long-term goals, who are committed to ideas rather than simply making money, are the long threads in the fabric of our society. And the role that artists play to the health of our society is massive. And the problem is, as corporate culture continues and values get altered based on that, it's not a good thing for our society. It's a very unhealthy development.
Okay, but let's look at it. Okay, so there's more than 3 million, people have been to my lectures before, I apologize because I bring up some things over again. There are more than 3 million people who are self-proclaimed artists in America, more artists than lawyers, okay?
But the artists are the most litigation-oriented professional group.
And there's a joke somewhere in there that involves a rabbi, but I'm not quite sure. Is that necessarily a good thing? I mean, you're devoted to the history of art and an elite activity. I would argue that there might be 50 or 100 of those 3 million who really have something to offer the history of art. Is it good that there's 2.5 million Sunday painters and academic ones at schools, or does it matter to you? Or are we talking about this little tiny size?
But you know the process better than that. Never forget, Jackson Pollock was the worst student in Thomas Hart Benton's class. Terrible. And he had to change art to include himself. Huh? And that's what's great. What looks terrible and ugly and doesn't look like art, sometimes is very important, call it experimentation, that's necessary.
But
So the bets are off as to what artists are going to end up making a valuable contribution or not. The ones who, there's an expression, talent does what it can, genius what it must. This is romantic crap, but it's actually instructive romantic crap,
Well, being an artist has become a middle class, bourgeois, acceptable activity in a way that I don't know, your parents, when you told them that you want to be an artist, they might have looked at you like, oh my God.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and
for sure.
where you went to school, there wasn't a degree, or where you used to teach, there were no degrees. Now there's BFAs at 5,000 colleges, and if you tell mom and dad you want to be an artist, they go, huh, and you show them the New York Times and Art Basel and the auctions, they're suddenly happy. Has that helped or hurt? Or
I grew up in Ohio in the 1950s. I was dragged into the guidance counselor's office at least once a month, treated like a juvenile delinquent. I could never figure out why. I was not, I was an introverted kid, hard to believe, but I was. And but I was, my father had been briefly a pitcher for the New York Giants. I mean, and he kept throwing baseballs, and I'd run and play with my crayons. It was the kind of, the great Santini, if you've seen the film. But the thing that struck me was after a while, I had a friend who was working in the guidance counselor's office, and found out that I had the highest IQ in the high school. And I wasn't a math and science person. And there was a Sputnik race going on. And I was a juvenile delinquent from the point of view of the people running the school and all that. So I stuck to it, as you can see. Nothing's clear. We have to make it clear for ourselves in the context of our life. Nobody's going to hand clarity to you about what to do.
But let's take
some
questions from the audience
to
see where we might go. There's a microphone there with audio. If you raise your hand, if somebody has a question, and identify not so much by name, but if you're an artist, a dealer, a collector, lost and found.
Don't talk about my sex life, Johnny. I'm warning you right now.
Every 7 years. Now, just while we have you here on the spot, a little bit irrelevant maybe to the conversation, but since you're not only one of the greatest living artists, but also one of the greatest living characters in what we know as Bohemian society over the years, could you please tell us what is your most memorable work of art that you've created and your most memorable story of all the stories that you have?
Well, there are, of course, memorable life experiences, and if you're an artist, your life is making artworks. So they're all, of course, fused in that way. I think one of the, they pop to your mind, and it's almost quasi-arbitrary, the ones that you would cite. But certainly, I was doing a series of installations called Guests and Foreigners, and I was doing them virtually all over the world. And I did it for the city of Frankfurt in honor of Goethe's birthday, his Italian voyage. I did a variety of, for EMA, when I did the retrospective of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, I did the big installation based on Joyce out of Ireland and Wittgenstein in Ireland, things like that. Well, so I was invited to New Zealand. I'd never been there. To Wellington. There was a big, beautiful new building, a museum, and I was to be the first big show. And I was doing Guests and Foreigners. And so essentially what the work was about is I went in to that, as I always do, my work's always at least partially linguistically connected to where the work's shown and also part of the cultural context, et cetera. So I was interested in the Maori Indians, the indigenous people in New Zealand, and what happened to them when the Brits arrived on their shores, right? So this work was about this relationship between the Maori and the British.
Enough about me. Let's go to another question so that we can stay a little bit more on topic too, and you can go
Take it
offline.
around him, yeah.
Do we have?
Hi, first of all, thanks so much. That was really interesting and amusing. And it just got me thinking, as somebody who used to be a professional art historian and is now a professional fundraiser for museums, I don't know, I agree that the corporatization of culture it's just the state of culture right now. But then looking
Well, we're responsible for the world that we make. I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
But as a fundraiser now, I see there is so much activity that's enabled through corporate sponsorship of art in a museum context. And I was just hoping maybe you could just say a few words of your thoughts about that. When I see firsthand how these education departments are built and outreach is done, and I agree, like the Coca-Colonization of the world I find very upsetting, but I've seen so much good come from the right sponsors for the right arts initiatives.
Right now, my major fundraising activity, I was invited in Paris to do, if you know, the four towers. This was Mitterrand's pet architectural project, is the Bibliothèque Nationale. There's four towers which are like open books, and they make it sort of four right angles, shall we say. And they invited me to do the permanent work which joins the four towers. And as it's a text by Michel Foucault, not a very known one, and the letters will be 2.6 meters high. I'm told that for the half of Paris that can't see the Eiffel Tower, they'll see my work, which is rather daunting. And, you know, I think of all those romantic films of the Eiffel Tower. I don't know if I'm up to it. But anyway, it's a significant fundraising activity because it's really big work. Fortunately, Bruno Racine, who is the director or president of the library, is responsible for that and not me. But and we're just very much hoping that he manages it. So I'm using this. No, I'm kidding. The other thing is my work, also in Paris, is the big project I did there that goes to about 700 meters long, and it goes through the 12th century walls of the original Louvre Palace, which were discovered when they built the pyramid at the Louvre. And so it just snakes its way all the way through. And this is like the underground highway which sends the visitors to the Louvre to different wings of it. And it's one of the most breathtaking, beautiful parts of the Louvre. And when I said, where should I do my shows? They said, oh, look around, figure out where you'd like to be, okay? And a lot of people thought I would be doing a work like I did at the Brooklyn Museum, going into the collection. But as a lot of artists sort of did that after me, I didn't see any reason to follow the people that followed me. So anyway, I wanted to deal with the accumulated history of the world's culture, which the Louvre is a very special place for that. And other than the facade of the Louvre, which I wasn't offered, this was the best bet. And so that will go up permanently in the next couple of months, I'm happy to say. So the joke around the studio is not who has the best work in the Louvre, but who has the biggest.
We have time for one more question. If someone, you have two questions or one? One, okay.
We could do two half questions as well.
I fall into the other category. I'm art journalist. And my question is, I have several friends who are very good artists, and they make very good conceptual work and things like that, and they also work with brands. What would you say to those artists about working with brands?
Well, I had to give a special name for it at the beginning, right? Because it was very, very difficult for people to take it as art, quite frankly. And I thought that was a good thing, right? When I was 24, I was invited by Leo Castelli to do a show, and all my heroes were there. But on the other hand, it was heavily institutional in a way, and I was coming from a 68 generation that was very critical of this. But I realized that if I worked with Leo, a lot of people, maybe 80%, who would not want to take conceptual art seriously, would be a little bit obliged to. And so that was one very strong reason to do it. But what I realized with a certain moment was I had to give it this special name to get it acceptance, conceptual art. You know, it was almost apologetic in a funny way. Decades later, artists could do virtually, in terms of, you know, how it is physically manifested and put in the world, et cetera, same kind of work, and they could just call it art. And I realized that over those decades, something had happened. Whether I could see that as a description of success or a failure in some very other murkier ways, it's probably beside the point. The thing was that the work I did and the work my colleagues did at the time really changed art. And for me, that's the high point of creativity. If your work can have that effect. Not make just a new work, but present a new idea of art into the world. So for that, I'm quite happy. I'm also very happy that it changed something else that was very fundamental. The model of the artist was the male, expressionist, Christ-like, shaman-like figure, right? No wonder it was impossible for women to have a chance as artists. What conceptual art did, it leveled the playing field. Gender wasn't the issue, ideas were the issue. And we've seen, since then, the best artists have been more women than men. And if we remember the 80s, it won't be the phallocentric paintings of Schnabel and Basel, etc. It will be photos by women like Cindy Sherman. Or, you know the list. But so that's another good legacy of what we began that I'm happy about.
Well, our time is up. Thank you, Joseph. It was good to renew all this.